In the winter of 1944, the Mediterranean looked deceptively calm, its silver horizon giving no hint of the silent maneuvers unfolding beneath its surface. Few Allied operations were more obscure than the covert transfer of advanced radar components to Soviet forces preparing for a renewed push into Crimea. Yet this mission, routed through the Bosporus and into the contested waters of the Black Sea, would become one of the least explained wartime disappearances of the entire conflict. And at the center of it was a small British-led convoy, known unofficially among planners as Route Midas, a route where secrecy was valued more than firepower. The mission began in Alexandria, Egypt, under conditions of strict compartmentalization. The primary cargo vessel, HMS Calderwood, a converted merchantman assigned to the Royal Navy's Auxiliary Patrol Service, was loaded with bulky wooden crates containing Type 271 radar sets, encrypted communication units, and spare magnetrons. Two escort vessels, HMS Leamington and HMS Ludlow, both older US-built destroyers transferred under Lend-Lease, were assigned to accompany her north. Their crews, a mix of Royal Navy sailors and American technical liaisons, were briefed only with their navigation orders, not the purpose of the mission. One officer later wrote in his diary, "We were told nothing, except that this run mattered more than our lives. That tends to focus a man's mind." The secrecy was justified. The Germans had grown increasingly aggressive in their attempts to intercept Allied aid flowing to the Soviet Union. Luftwaffe maritime bombers operated out of airfields in Crete and Greece, E-boats prowled the narrowing channels of the Aegean, and intelligence leaks, some later suspected to have stemmed from neutral ports, made every convoy movement a calculated risk. The British Admiralty believed that a low-profile, mixed-flag convoy would draw less attention than a larger formation. The challenge, however, went beyond evading the enemy. The convoy had to pass through the Bosporus Strait, officially neutral Turkey's waters, without breaching Ankara's delicate diplomatic balance. Britain had negotiated a temporary corridor for non-combatant transports, but this meant the destroyers were required to shield their armaments and travel under reduced visibility at dawn. As the three vessels approached the strait, crews stood at silent stations, engines humming at a slow, steady beat. Crossing the Bosporus was a sensory contrast. Fishing boats drifting along the Asian shore, the distant calls from minarets, the early sun catching the old stone fortifications. Beneath this peaceful facade lay a diplomatic minefield. Any sign of hostility could have closed the strait entirely. For a brief moment, the war felt far away, but the crews knew the most dangerous waters still lay ahead. Once inside the Black Sea, the strategic equation changed. The German 1st Air Corps operated intermittently over the region. The Kriegsmarine maintained a limited flotilla but relied heavily on Romanian and Bulgarian naval support for coastal defense. And yet, strangely, in the first days of the convoy's northward journey, enemy patrol activity appeared lighter than expected. Lookouts reported empty horizons where aircraft should have been spotted, and radio intercept teams heard nothing but static from German channels. Lieutenant Commander Peter Hall of HMS Leamington noted in a private report, "Their silence was uncanny. Either we were lucky, or someone expected us." Tension aboard the ships grew. Sailors were ordered to double-watch cycles, and gunnery crews slept beside their stations. On Calderwood, the radio officer, one of only 3 men authorized to break seal on the convoy's encrypted codes, reported faint directional interference, as though a distant signal were probing for their frequency. It was dismissed at the time as atmospheric distortion. The deeper the convoy traveled, the more the Black Sea revealed its contradictory nature. Calm, glass-like waters in the morning could shift to low, rolling swells by dusk. Weather was fickle. But in mid-March 1944, records confirmed the sea was unusually stable. No storms, no heavy winds, and near-perfect visibility across most daylight hours. Navigation during these calm days should have been easy. Instead, crew members described a mounting unease. One petty officer later recalled, "Everything was too quiet. Nothing moved out there. Not a shadow, not a silhouette. It was as if the sea had emptied itself." Still, the mission pressed forward. The convoy's rendezvous point with Soviet coastal elements near Novorossiysk was scheduled for March 18. The British Admiralty expected confirmation signals at intervals, but only one short encrypted check-in was sent around dusk on March 17, reporting progress normal and course as plotted. That message would be the last Allied forces ever received. As the sun dipped behind the Crimean coastline that evening, the three vessels pushed deeper into waters where German and Soviet claims often overlapped, and where the line between reported and unreported enemy activity grew dangerously thin. No one aboard the convoy suspected that within hours, all three ships would vanish without a trace, leaving behind one of World War II's most perplexing maritime mysteries. And as darkness settled over the Black Sea, a new question began to take shape, one that investigators would struggle with for decades. How could an entire convoy disappear in calm seas, without a single distress signal? At dawn on March 16, 1944, the Black Sea looked almost metallic, flat, cold, and seemingly empty. Yet for the men aboard HMS Calderwood, HMS Leamington, and HMS Ludlow, the emptiness offered no comfort. This region was known not for its storms, but for its unpredictable patterns of patrols, mines, and Luftwaffe reconnaissance flights that could appear without warning. For Allied crews, it was a place where calm water often signaled danger, not safety. And as the convoy pressed north, they found themselves sandwiched between overlapping spheres of German, Romanian, and Bulgarian operational zones. The convoy's lead escort, HMS Leamington, was hardly a frontline destroyer by 1944 standards. Originally launched in 1919 as a U.S. Navy vessel, she had seen service in the Atlantic before being transferred to Britain. Her radar was temperamental, her boiler systems aging, and her crew was overworked after months of Mediterranean escort duty. Still, her officers were experienced, their focus sharpened by a nagging sense that the enemy's uncharacteristic silence masked something more deliberate. Meanwhile, HMS Ludlow, her sister ship, maintained a starboard position, monitoring coastal signatures and scanning for S-boat wakes. On the Calderwood, Captain Harold Mercer kept a cautious pace. A modest, stocky man known for his methodical discipline, Mercer had been selected specifically because he understood convoy operations better than most auxiliary captains. He knew the German Naval Command, the Seekriegsleitung, had intensified its interest in intercepting special cargo shipments, those carrying cryptographic material, radar components, or intelligence officers. The moment he heard that the Luftwaffe had been unusually quiet for 2 consecutive days, he felt something tighten in his stomach. One of Mercer's bridge notes from March 16 survives in an archived folder. No sightings. No tracks. Unusual. Enemy patterns inconsistent with reconnaissance norms. Recommend heightened alert. The tension among officers was matched by strain among the enlisted men. Long hours on deck left their eyes scanning empty horizons, searching for the slightest hint of movement. Some sailors claimed they could sense when German aircraft were approaching, even before radar or listening gear detected them. But now, the sky remained stubbornly blank. Still, the convoy had reason to push forward. Intelligence reports indicated that Soviet 18th Army units were preparing to receive the radar shipment near the port of Novorossiysk. The radar sets, specifically the Type 271 and Type 286 units, were crucial for detecting German fast attack boats and low-flying aircraft. British planners understood that enhancing Soviet coastal detection would support the larger Allied goal of pressuring Axis positions in Crimea. The strategic logic was sound. Yet logic alone couldn't account for the convoy's nagging problem. The enemy patrols simply weren't where they should have been. At 14:20, the radar operator aboard Leamington reported an intermittent blip, one that appeared, vanished, and reappeared again at irregular intervals. It was too faint to be a ship and too inconsistent to be a standard Luftwaffe reconnaissance plane. When Lieutenant Hall ordered a bearing plot, the signal dissolved. He later described it as a ghost echo, like something testing our range from just beyond the horizon. That night, the convoy passed within 60 nautical miles of the Crimean coastline. Veteran sailors knew this area well. German S-boats had been active here earlier in the war, striking Soviet shipping at night with devastating accuracy. Yet reports from the same week indicated that German naval units had suddenly reduced operations, possibly due to fuel shortages. Strangely, there was nothing to suggest that the convoy was being tracked, or even noticed. But by March 17th, circumstances shifted. Ludlow's wireless operator intercepted a fragment of an encrypted German message. The text was incomplete, but it contained two words that no Allied commander wanted to see: Convoy and Nordkurs, Convoy, northbound. A chill ran through the signal room. Someone, somewhere, had identified them. It wasn't clear whether the Germans had their exact position or merely a general direction, but the effect on morale was immediate. Gunnery teams ran silent drills. Lookouts intensified scanning rotations. Officers debated altering course, but the convoy could not deviate far without risking encroachment into mineable waters. One Calderwood crewman later recounted, "It felt like we were walking across a field we knew was wired, but had no map for." Compounding this sense of vulnerability were reports from one of the American technicians aboard Leamington who noticed intermittent interference on the ship's HF band. He explained it as a probing signal, as if someone were sweeping the channel. By the afternoon of March 17th, the wind dropped again, and the surface of the sea became unervingly smooth, perfect conditions for the wake signature of any approaching vessel or periscope to stand out. But nothing appeared. No wakes, no silhouettes, no glints of metal on the horizon. The calm only deepened the anxiety. Late that evening, the convoy transmitted a brief check-in, reporting their speed, heading, and estimated time of arrival. It was short, coded, and routine. But unbeknownst to them, it would be the last confirmed message they ever sent. As darkness settled over the Black Sea, the tension aboard the ships began to feel heavier than the air itself. Somewhere in the night, unseen, unheard, something was shifting around them. And although no sailor could articulate it, many later said they felt as if the convoy had crossed an invisible line, stepping into a zone where the war's normal rules no longer applied. What happened next would defy both Allied and Axis expectations, and leave historians grappling with contradictions that remain unresolved to this day. The night of March 18, 1944, began with a clarity that sailors often mistrusted. The air hung cool and dry above the Black Sea, and visibility stretched for miles under a pale crescent moon. For most Allied shipping routes, such pristine conditions offered reassurance. But for the men aboard HMS Calderwood, HMS Leamington, and HMS Ludlow, the stillness felt unnatural. Too calm, too empty, too exposed. Their navigators knew that the closer they drew to the Crimean coastline, the more they entered a patchwork of German, Romanian, and Soviet surveillance zones where radar signals crossed and vanished in overlapping sweeps. Yet on this night, neither Allied nor enemy operators would record anything unusual, except for one brief signal the convoy itself transmitted. Shortly after dusk, Calderwood's radio officer, Petty Officer Thomas Irons, tapped out a short, encrypted status report. It included their projected coordinates, a progress confirmation, and a notation indicating that external conditions were stable. It was intended to reassure the Admiralty and Soviet liaison units monitoring in Novorossiysk. The message arrived cleanly. Decoded without delay. Logged without concern. No further communication followed. What came next was marked by absence, not action. Soviet coastal radar stations positioned near Gelendzhik and Tuapse were among the most experienced in the region. Operators there routinely tracked German torpedo craft leaving Constanza, Luftwaffe reconnaissance flights probing along the coast, and even Allied vessels when coordinates had been prearranged. On the night of March 18th, they detected the British-led convoy moving nearly 40 nautical miles offshore, 3 distinct echoes maintaining steady formation. At approximately 23:52 Moscow time, the signatures disappeared. The duty log from the 62nd Soviet Radar Battalion contains a terse, 2-line entry. Contact lost. 3 surface targets faded simultaneously. No weather interference detected. Simultaneous disappearance was the detail that raised alarm. If a single ship vanished, a radar blind spot or mechanical issue might explain it. If 2 dropped, perhaps interference or overlapping sweeps. But all 3 at once suggested either catastrophic action or a coordinated maneuver. Yet there were no distress signals, no sudden bursts of radioactivity, and no German reports of engagement. Meanwhile, aboard the ships themselves, according to the few fragments pieced together from diaries left behind by crewmen who had written during the earlier days of the voyage, the tension had peaked. Crew rotations had gone into compressed cycles, with gunners sleeping at their posts and navigators double-checking bearings. One Leamington seaman, able seaman Victor Harrow, had written only hours before, "The sea is empty. No sign of life. It feels like something is waiting just beyond eyesight." His notebook was later recovered from his belongings held at base, discovered weeks after the convoy failed to reach port. As midnight neared, the Black Sea maintained a glassy surface, conditions that made any underwater disturbance, surfacing submarine, or torpedo wake stand out under moonlight. Observers along the Crimean coast, from both German and Soviet positions, reported nothing unusual. Nor did Luftwaffe logs show radar activity indicating an aerial strike. No flares were seen. No fires spotted. No explosions heard. In the absence of eyewitness accounts, investigators later attempted to reconstruct the possible sequence of events. One theory was that the convoy may have entered an uncharted minefield, but post-war analysis of German and Romanian mine records showed no belts laid along that stretch of sea. Another hypothesis suggested a coordinated U-boat attack, but the Kriegsmarine kept meticulous operational logs, and none reported contacts with an Allied convoy in the region that night. German U-boat presence in the Black Sea had also been drastically reduced by early 1944, with only a handful of vessels operating under tight constraints. Then there was the theory of navigational error. Perhaps the convoy strayed off course. But their last transmission aligned perfectly with expected coordinates, and the Soviet radar track confirmed their position within a tolerable margin. Which left a deeper, more troubling question. If no recorded enemy action occurred, and no natural disaster struck, how could 3 ships simply vanish? Soviet search operations began early on March 19. The 18th Army dispatched patrol boats and reconnaissance aircraft to the sector where the convoy's radar echoes had last appeared. Over the next 4 days, they scanned more than 320 square nautical miles. Not a single item surfaced, no wreckage, no oil slick, no life rings, no cargo crates. The Soviet report, translated by British intelligence, was brutally direct. Sea area surveyed. No material evidence located. Probability of total loss remains unexplained. British investigators struggled with the implications. Warships did not simply disintegrate without trace. Even catastrophic hits left debris. Even shipboard explosions produced oil plumes. The fact that nothing rose to the surface, nothing, was almost unprecedented. As Admiralty analysts reviewed the convoy's final hours, they were particularly drawn to the radar officer's earlier claim of faint interference. Could the convoy have been tracked by an unregistered German unit? Could encrypted messages have been compromised? The absence of patrols in the days leading up to the disappearance now appeared less coincidental and more suspicious. If someone had wanted the convoy to vanish, the signs may have been hidden in the silence. By the end of March, one conclusion became unavoidable. The disappearance of the Black Sea convoy had no conventional explanation supported by wartime records. And the longer analysts stared at the timeline, the more troubling the gaps became. The vanishing signatures. The empty horizon. The lack of debris. The adversary that should have been present, but wasn't. The mystery had only begun to take shape, and the next stage of the investigation would push British and Soviet intelligence to question assumptions they had long accepted as fact. For investigators on both sides of the Eastern Front, the most perplexing element of the March 18 disappearance was the silence of the enemy. In a war where every ship lost, downed aircraft, or skirmish was dutifully recorded in operational logs, the Black Sea left behind no German record, no claim of a kill, no report of contact, no mention of a nocturnal engagement. When British analysts first received captured Kriegsmarine documents for the Crimean sector, they expected to find clues buried in the minutiae. Instead, they found emptiness. German naval archives for the night of March 18 to 19, 1944, from the Sea Commandant Schwarz's Meer, contained only routine entries. Patrol routes described by the Romanian torpedo boats TMS-7 and TMS-8 placed them more than 70 miles from the convoy's last known position. Luftwaffe Kampfgeschwader 26, the unit responsible for maritime strike operations, logged no sorties after 2000 hours due to fuel rationing and maintenance delays. The German 1st Air Corps radar reports for the night were equally sparse. No unidentified signatures, no surface contacts, no unusual interference. To the relief and frustration of Allied analysts, the enemy appeared almost benign. And yet, this benignity made the convoy's disappearance more alarming. When the first British inquiry began in late April, one officer stated bluntly, "The absence of evidence is itself the evidence." He was referring to the convoy's operating zone, territory known for overlapping acoustic shadows, minefields, and contested patrol lanes. Something should have left a mark, even if that mark took the form of a garbled transmission or a suspicious German notation. But the more the analysts dug, the more the trail dissolved. Among the earliest theories was the minefield hypothesis. During 1941–42, both Axis and Soviet forces had seeded sections of the Black Sea with naval mines, contact mines, magnetic mines, and moored devices placed to block invasion corridors. If the convoy had drifted even slightly off course, it could have struck such a field. But the Admiralty dispatched Commander Alastair Forbes, a veteran mines specialist, to examine German defensive laying records. His conclusion was precise. No minefield existed within a 12-mile radius of the convoy's plotted track. Furthermore, the Soviet Navy had repeatedly swept the region in early 1944 to prepare for their Crimean offensives. The search teams sent after the disappearance detected no exploded moorings, no suspended debris, and no snapped cables, findings that would normally accompany a mine detonation. If not mines, then U-boats? But here too, the evidence collapsed under scrutiny. By 1944, the U-boats flotille stationed in the Black Sea had dwindled dramatically. Fuel shortages, failing infrastructure, and the loss of Axis Romanian ports had crippled operations. The remaining German submarines, U-19, U-20, and U-23, were tracked almost continuously by Soviet surveillance. Their war diaries for March show no engagements, no torpedoes expended, and no recorded contact with Allied ships. Their commanders were meticulous note-takers, bound by Kriegsmarine doctrine. None could have sunk a convoy without leaving a trace in their logs. As alternatives were eliminated, the tone of the investigation changed, from searching for a tactical explanation to questioning whether the convoy had been compromised before it even reached the Black Sea. British intelligence, aware of several encryption breaches earlier in the war, began to suspect that a German signals unit might have intercepted the convoy's encoded traffic. Yet Bletchley Park analysts found no corresponding decrypts in German Enigma intercept collections. Even more telling was the absence of follow-up reconnaissance. If the Germans had known about the convoy, why wasn't there an aerial sweep, a surface sortie, or at minimum an intelligence marker identifying a potential target? Their silence was too complete. Soviet records, declassified decades later, contain a memo from Colonel Yuri Nedishkevich of the NKVD's Naval Counterintelligence Wing. Dated April 7, 1944, it reads, "We must examine what is not recorded. Enemy movements that should exist but do not. Patrols that should be present but were not dispatched. It is in the omissions that the pattern emerges." It was a prescient observation. The investigators began seeing the disappearance not as a moment of violence, but as an event preceded by subtle unexplained shifts, reduced enemy patrols, gaps in reconnaissance, faint radio interference, and the convoy's own sense that movement around them had diminished. The evidence painted a picture of a corridor made quiet, too quiet, just long enough for the convoy to pass through. Then came the next mystery, the total lack of debris. When the Soviet Black Sea Fleet conducted its sweeping operations, divers reported clean seabeds with no sign of fractured hulls or displaced cargo. Aircraft flew grid patterns, observing for oil slicks or floating debris. Nothing appeared, not a life raft, not a crate, not an oiled feather. Warships did not simply vanish without leaving scars. One search officer later recalled, It was as if the sea refused to give up anything. British investigators grew increasingly uneasy. The war had produced countless mysteries, but few involved multiple ships disappearing simultaneously under perfect atmospheric conditions, in a mapped corridor, with no enemy activity. And so, the Admiralty was forced to confront the worst-case question. Could the convoy have been deliberately misled, through corrupted navigation signals, false beacons, or falsified intelligence, into a zone where its fate would remain unrecorded? As spring warmed the Black Sea, diplomatic exchanges between London and Moscow intensified. Both sides sought a culprit, but none emerged. Only the same chilling fact remained. 3 ships, 37 officers, and more than 200 sailors had entered a calm, predictable stretch of water, and left no trace behind. The mystery was deepening, and soon the search for answers would shift from the sea itself to the shadowed world of wartime intelligence. In late 1944, long after the Black Sea convoy had failed to arrive at Novorossiysk, British intelligence officers gathered in a cramped, dimly lit room beneath the Admiralty's old building in Whitehall. On the table lay scattered interrogation transcripts, fragments of intercepted German communications, and Soviet dispatches translated overnight. The mission had been classified as unresolved operational loss, a bureaucratic phrase masking profound unease. For a convoy to vanish without debris contradicted every established wartime pattern. And so, investigators began turning their attention away from the sea and toward the realm of human decisions, intentions, and failures. Among the early leads were transcripts from German naval prisoners held at camps in Egypt and Palestine. Many had served aboard Romanian or Kriegsmarine vessels patrolling the Black Sea. Their testimonies were consistent. By early 1944, Axis forces were struggling to maintain any kind of effective maritime surveillance. Fuel shortages grounded aircraft. Mine layers were overextended. Radar coverage was patchy at best. But within these testimonies came an intriguing thread. Several prisoners mentioned rumors of a special British convoy that had been expected but never confirmed. One Romanian petty officer stated under questioning, "There were whispers of ships moving north, but the officers said nothing appeared on our sets." British analysts were troubled. Rumors implied partial awareness. Someone, somewhere, within Axis command circles had information that should not have been available. But the logs from the same period contained no actionable intelligence, no intercepts, no sightings. It was as if the knowledge spread informally, through channels that left no documentary trace. Soviet intelligence provided another layer of complexity. The 1944 NKVD files, still limited at the time and laced with political caution, revealed that their own internal investigators believed the convoy had been targeted through compromised Allied encryption. A declassified 1991 memo, referencing earlier findings, summarized their position succinctly. The incident must be viewed through the lens of signals vulnerability rather than naval action. This perspective arose from a troubling pattern. In the weeks leading up to the disappearance, Soviet officers had detected interference on Allied frequencies used for convoy updates. They were faint, irregular pulses, too subtle to identify but strong enough to suggest deliberate probing. One Soviet operator described it as a wolf testing the fence. British analysts revisited the idea. Could the convoy's course have been tracked through long-range direction finding? Could the Germans have intercepted the brief signals that Allied crews believed were secure? If so, why was there no record of an attack? That absence led to a darker hypothesis. What if the convoy had been lured into danger by manipulated signals? During 1943 and early 1944, German intelligence units had experimented with false radio beacon techniques in the Aegean and Norwegian seas. While there was no direct evidence of these methods being used in the Black Sea, analysts could not dismiss the possibility. The convoy was operating in waters where navigational errors could be catastrophic. Reefs, uncharted shoals, or old wreck sites that could tear open a hull. A subtle shift in bearings, perhaps only a few degrees, might have sent the ships into an area never meant for transit. But even this theory failed to explain the lack of debris. As winter gave way to spring, the Soviet Navy expanded its search to deeper waters using diverse and primitive sonar sets. The team surveyed suspected sites identified by German maps, Soviet charts, and British calculations of drift and current. Week after week, the reports returned empty. Divers found only encrusted chains from older wrecks and fragments from Soviet ships lost earlier in the war. One diver later recalled, "We expected at least a scattered board or metal piece. But the sea gave us nothing." The failure to find evidence led to speculation that the ships might have suffered some type of catastrophic internal event, cargo explosion, fuel ignition, or simultaneous detonation of ammunition stores. But the Calderwood transported sensitive radar equipment, not explosives, and the Lend-Lease destroyers carried limited ordnance during the mission. Simultaneous explosions across 3 vessels defied both logic and physics. So investigators turned to paperwork, to the codes, the schedules, the briefing chain. A troubling pattern emerged. Only a small circle within the British Admiralty knew the convoy's full route. Their communications were sealed, logged, and monitored. Yet several inconsistencies appeared: a routing instruction amended hours after issuance, a weather forecast filed under an incorrect index, and a discrepancy in timing between the Admiralty's last outbound signal and the convoy's own transmission log. Individually, each could be chalked up to administrative error. Together, they hinted at either infiltration or a procedural vulnerability. The most unsettling discovery came from a Soviet document dated months after the disappearance. It referenced a Western liaison concern regarding message integrity, and included a cryptic footnote: "Possibility of deliberate manipulation of convoy route cannot be excluded." Investigation hindered by lack of surviving evidence. The British, for their part, avoided this conclusion in their official summary. Political necessity demanded cooperation, not suspicion. But privately, some officers admitted what they could not state publicly. If the convoy had been betrayed, whether through compromised codes, signal tampering, or internal leak, the truth might never surface. By October 1944, the Admiralty's internal report closed with a line that investigators found unsatisfactory. Circumstances point to an unobserved loss under unknown conditions. Unknown conditions, an antiseptic phrase masking fear, uncertainty, and the grim reality that even after examining every document, every logbook, every prisoner interrogation, nothing explained how 3 ships vanished without trace. As the months passed, the case grew colder. The war surged on toward its final, catastrophic chapters. Attention shifted to Normandy, Arnhem, the Ardennes, and the Red Army's push into Eastern Europe. But to those who studied the disappearance, one question refused to fade: if enemy action did not silence the convoy, and nature did not claim it, then what human decision, recorded or unrecorded, sent those ships into a corridor from which they would never return? The boundary between mistake and sabotage had narrowed, and the search for truth was now drifting toward the post-war years, where new documents, and new controversies, waited in sealed archives. When the war ended in Europe in May 1945, millions celebrated liberation and victory. But for a small circle of naval officers in London and Moscow, the end of the conflict brought no relief, only renewed urgency. With the guns silent and the paperwork of collapsing regimes spilling across Europe, investigators hoped that somewhere, buried in the ruins of German offices or locked in forgotten filing cabinets, was the missing piece that would explain the Black Sea disappearance. They were wrong. The official British classification, unresolved operational loss, was intended as a placeholder, not a verdict. As post-war committees formed to document the war's maritime casualties, the convoy's case stood out starkly. 3 ships gone, no wreckage, no survivors, no German claim. In the cold logic of naval warfare, the absence of all 4 elements was not just rare. It was almost unprecedented. Internal Admiralty discussions reveal how deeply this troubled senior officers. One marginal note in a 1946 summary reads, "We have wrecks of ships lost in storms, torpedoed, mined, scuttled. But of these 3 we have nothing. No oil, no wood, no metal. This is an absence we cannot catalogue." Post-war Soviet commentary, once heavily censored, later provided glimpses into how their side interpreted the disappearance. In a set of declassified memos from the 1990s, A senior Soviet naval historian described the event as a case where the documentary vacuum is the primary data point. His meaning was simple. What was missing mattered more than what remained. Both navies expected tangible remnants in such a loss. None appeared. That vacuum tempted speculation. In 1947, a joint British-Soviet working group revisited the final hours of the Convoy's track. Their conversations quickly turned toward the Convoy's operational secrecy. If the mission had been deliberately concealed even from many Allied officers, who exactly had known the route? Which departments handled the signal traffic? And who had access to the encoded instructions? The deeper they dug, the clearer it became that the route had passed through fewer hands than most wartime operations, a fact meant to safeguard it, but which complicated post-war analysis. One British archivist later wrote, "There were fewer points of failure, fewer opportunities for interception. Yet something went wrong." That paradox defined the case. The working group also consulted German experts in naval cryptography, some of whom had served under the B-Dienst, Germany's code-breaking unit. Their post-war testimonies confirmed that while the Germans had enjoyed intermittent success with Allied naval codes earlier in the war, there was no record, formal or informal, of decrypting a March 1944 Black Sea convoy. None claimed knowledge of the event. One former officer even remarked, "Had we sunk 3 British ships in a single night with no losses, we would have made certain Berlin knew." This sentiment came up repeatedly. Such an action, if accomplished, would have been publicized internally, if not externally. Its absence suggested either ignorance or deliberate omission, two very different possibilities, neither of which aligned with standard German procedure. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, as tensions between NATO and the Soviet Union hardened into the Cold War, the disappearance remained a quiet point of curiosity in naval circles but never rose to political prominence. It was overshadowed by larger, more strategically significant wartime mysteries. Yet the convoy resurfaced periodically in academic journals or small, closed-door naval conferences. Each time, experts arrived at the same unsettling impasse. The known evidence could not support any single explanation without contradiction. It was only in the early 1990s, after the Soviet Union dissolved, that a new wave of documents entered the public domain. Among them was an internal Ministry of Defense review referencing the March 18 convoy. The file was thin and incomplete, but one line stood out. The matter was raised again due to questions regarding Allied cryptographic reliability in 1944. No resolution. Issue considered sensitive due to lack of material proof. The phrase, "sensitive due to lack of material proof," carried a weight that historians immediately recognized. It was an admission that the absence of evidence had become politically inconvenient, not merely puzzling. As researchers sifted through the widened archive, they identified a handful of intriguing but inconclusive hints: a Soviet note questioning the accuracy of Allied radio bearings, a British correction to a navigation log that could not be matched to its source, a German record of radar malfunction that, by coincidence or design, aligned with the convoy's final hours. Each fragment raised questions, but none coalesced into certainty. The modern view of the disappearance blends caution with unresolved curiosity. Most historians believe the convoy suffered a sudden and catastrophic event, perhaps navigational misdirection, a collision with uncharted hazards, or a coordinated but undocumented enemy action. A smaller group leans toward the theory of signal interference or deception, noting the faint radio anomalies reported before the loss. And a few consider the possibility that internal intelligence failures, whether accidental or deliberate, contributed to the convoy's fate. All agree on one point: the lack of physical evidence remains the greatest barrier to understanding. Today, the Black Sea is littered with wrecks from centuries of conflict, but the search area for the convoy remains vast and largely unmapped at depth. Modern sonar has only scratched the surface. Some naval researchers hope that future underwater surveys, powered by autonomous vehicles, might one day locate the remains of Calderwood, Leamington, and Ludlow. Others believe the ships may lie in anoxic depths where visibility is minimal and discovery unlikely. As the decades pass, the disappearance has shifted from a wartime puzzle to a case study in the limits of historical reconstruction. In a war defined by records, logs, photographs, intercepts, diaries. The absence of debris from the Black Sea convoy is a haunting reminder of how much can still be swallowed by silence. 3 ships. 200 men. No distress call. No wreckage. No definitive answer. And so the mystery endures, suspended between fact and uncertainty. An unresolved chapter in a conflict otherwise documented with relentless precision.